Hey guys, welcome back to Meghan Grace DIY and part 3 of our Easy Holiday Dress series. By the end of part 2 of this series, we had completed the entire shell of the dress as well as put in the lining. In part 3, we're going to complete all the finishing from the hem to the zipper to the cuffs. To move on to our finishing techniques, you're going to need to try the dress on at this point. The reason we're going to try the dress on is you're going to pin it in the back so you know where your zipper needs to be placed. Now, when I went and did this step, I realized that I either A, cut a little bit of a size too big, or B, I've also lost about 10 pounds over the last month and a half. So the dress was basically like humongous on me. So what I had to end up doing is you can see my pins marking my zipper. They're fairly far in. They're about 2 inches in. And then I also went underneath the arm and I took in the whole side seam an inch on each side. So it was a lot of extra fabric. But I think with those adjustments, it's going to fit quite a bit better. If you find yourself in a similar situation where you go to try the dress on and it's too big, I have found that sometimes patterns like overshoot the measurements a little bit. So you have a couple different options. You can either A, take the whole dress apart and recut it if it's like really ginormous on you. For me, I took it in at the side seam and then I'm also taking it in at the zipper. And right now I'm lining up my zipper to mark where 22 inches is, and that's how long our zipper is going to be. I have a longer zipper that I just had in my closet, so I'm going to do a little tie at the bottom to make sure that the zipper pull does not go all the way down. But just a little side note on sewing in general, it's always better for something to be too big than too small. You can't wish fabric back, but you can always take something in. So here I flipped my dress inside out, and I'm gonna start by pinning those 2 midriff seams together because remember we want our seams to be lined up perfectly. And the other thing I had to do because the dress is bigger than I thought it would be is remember all those times I told you to not sew that last 3/4 of an inch on your lining? Well, I had to undo that a little bit because my zipper is gonna come in 2 inches instead of 3/4 of an inch. So you may have to adjust that a little bit here. I'm gonna mark where 22 inches is or where my zipper would stop. And from the top of the dress to the zipper end, you're gonna do a basting stitch. And then from the zipper end to the end of the dress, you're gonna do a regular stitch. Now that I've sewn that one long seam that goes down the whole back of the dress, I pressed it open and we're gonna pin our zipper in place. I'm going to pin my linings out of the way just to make sure they don't get caught in the zipper. And just a reminder that from 22 inches down to the bottom of the skirt is a regular seam and 22 inches and up is a basting stitch. Now for the skirt, if you don't have a lining, you need to add in seam finishes along that seam. The type of zipper I'm executing, in case I didn't mention it before, is called a centered zipper. And that's where you create a seam and you press it open and then you pin the zipper teeth along that seam that you just created. Once the zipper is sewn in place, we'll undo the basting stitch, revealing the zipper. For this step, I'm taking my zipper teeth facing away from me and laying it on top of the seam, and I'm pinning my pins horizontally down the seam. You want to make sure that you're very, very accurate in terms of placing your zipper teeth right along your seam. If it's not placed correctly when you go to undo the basting stitch, your zipper is just not going to look correct. It's not going to look like a centered zipper. Another important point I think I should mention here is that you can really put in any type of zipper you want. If you prefer invisible zippers, you're more than welcome to use an invisible zipper here. I've just never really liked invisible zippers. I think I had too many bad experiences when I was learning how to sew and got so frustrated with them that they're just generally not my go-to zipper. But some people really, really love an invisible zipper and think that's the best option, especially for an evening type dress like we're making here. If you do decide you want to do an invisible zipper for this dress, I do recommend that you use an invisible zipper foot, not just a regular zipper foot. It makes putting an invisible zipper in much easier, and the whole goal of an invisible zipper is to make it invisible, or basically not really see any of that tape against the zipper teeth. And before I finish up my pinning, just a quick reminder, I'm only pinning my zipper to the outside shell fabric. I again want to make sure all of my lining is out of the way. We don't want it caught in our initial pass when we're sewing the zipper. A lot of people tend to get really stressed out over zippers, but if you have the proper foot in, I think it makes it 1,000 times easier and really relieves a lot of that stress. So I've got my zipper foot in place of my regular foot, and I'm starting sewing down the right side of the zipper. Now, as I sew down, I'm constantly feeling for my zipper teeth to make sure that they're still directly underneath the center seam. If at any point I feel like they're off, I will stop and just kind of reach underneath and readjust to make sure that those zipper teeth stay perfectly in the center. Hopefully you saw at the top that I didn't start perfectly at the top of the dress. I started below where the zipper pull was. If you try to start perfectly at the top and go around your zipper pull, you're going to create a bump in your seam, and we don't want that. So I started beneath the zipper pull. I'm going to go all the way down the right side of the zipper, and then I'm going to come back up the left side of the zipper. Once that's completed, I'm going to pull my zipper pull down and sew that little part at the top. That way it's nice and straight. As I'm sewing down the length of the zipper, I'm also removing any of the pins each time I come up to one, and I'm also constantly double checking that none of the lining has gotten caught underneath the zipper. That's a very, very common thing to happen, that you'll get a piece of your lining caught and you won't realize it, and you'll sew over it, and then you have to go back and undo those stitches and re-sew that area. And lastly, I think it's important to remember that there's no rush. You're not in a competition to finish this for anything or for anybody, so please take your time. It's going to be much more rewarding to take your time and do it right the first time than to rush through it and have it be messy and then have to end up redoing your zipper. In this scene right now, I've already come all the way down the right side. I pivoted and came across the bottom, and now I'm coming back up the left side of the zipper. Like I said before, putting a zipper into a dress that has this much material to it can be a little bit difficult. The material might bunch up around your machine, but that's okay. Take your time and you'll be really happy with the beautiful zipper that you finish up with. Now that the majority of my zipper is completed, I'm going to go back to the top and sew those little inch and a half, 2 inches portions that we skipped so we wouldn't be sewing around our zipper pull. We're going to repeat this step for the other side of the zipper, and don't forget, you want to leave your lining out at this portion. We're going to hand sew the lining in later. Now that we're back at our ironing board, most of what's going to come next is slip stitching down our lining and making the inside of the garment look just as good as the outside of the garment. Where we're going to start is the top of the bodice in the back around the zipper. So what I do is I usually from the outside pin the seam allowance of the zipper inside the garment so it's not a pain in my butt. And then I take my lining piece and I flip it under as much as I need to, because it could be a different measurement depending on how much you took it in. Like for me, it's 2 inches. For someone else, it might be a 1/2 inch. And I am going to pin along that zipper. Now, we don't want it to be laying over the zipper teeth, because then you could have like snags and pulls, and no girl likes that. We want to just make sure it is straight, about 1/4 inch away from the zipper, and we'll be ready to hand sew. When it comes to where the bodice meets the midriff, you want to take the midriff and lay it on top of the bodice lining, and then fold the two underneath together. Let's work our way along the inside of the zipper, placing as many pins as we feel we'll need to keep the lining in place. With our pinning complete, I'm taking a double-threaded needle and I'm going to slip stitch along the entire seam down the zipper. Now, at the top of the dress, you're going to have this little open space between where the zipper is sewn to the shell fabric and the lining. You want to start there. You want to close that up and make it look nice and finished. You're going to continue from there, and you're going to slip stitch the lining all the way down the inside of the bodice. And we'll eventually do it across the midriff as well. Now, if this is the first time you're hearing the word slip stitch, I'm going to put a link above on a specific tutorial on how to just do a slip stitch. I really advise that you check that out and learn how to do a slip stitch, since it is required for many garments. But the basic run over of a slip stitch is it's called a tunnel and bite technique. The tunnel is formed by the piece of fabric that's folded, and the bite is usually the area that you're covering up with the lining. So see here, I'm going through my tunnel and I pull my needle out, and then I'm going to take a little teeny bite of the zipper tape. You do this method on repeat until you reach the end of where you wish to slip stitch. Now that you made it all the way down both sides of the lining, I'm going to show you how to move on to the midriff. First things first, there's going to be this small gap between the midriff lining and the bodice lining, and we have to close that up. So I'm going to start by doing my slip stitch and just closing up that it's going to be like 1/2 inch, but we really want it closed. We want the inside of our garment to look totally beautiful. And of course, if at any point you run out of thread, you're just going to do a double knot, cut it, and rethread your needle. We're now going to move on to attaching the midriff to the zipper, also using a slip stitch. Now, remember when we did the top and I had a lot of extra seam allowance? I'm again going to pin my seam allowance out of the way, just so it doesn't get mixed up where I'm trying to slip stitch. So not only did I fold the piece of the midriff that's going to be attached to the zipper, I did a little bit of preemptive thinking here. I'm also going to fold the bottom of the midriff lining up about 1/2 inch, because after we complete this step, we're going to slip stitch the entire waistline. So that way we're creating a really nice finished corner with no rough edges. And now's a good time to remind you that if you haven't seam finished the seam allowance of the zipper portion of the skirt, make sure you do that. It's easy to forget, and it'll make your garment look even more professional once it's done. And if you can see where my hands are pointing here, I'm showing you how the waistband seam is going to push up inside the midriff, and you'll lay your lining piece on top of it, and you're eventually going to sew a circle around the entire garment. Let's continue our slip stitch extravaganza. Now, because my dress has some stretch to it, there may be a couple points where I have to ease one piece into another, and this is one of those points. Where the zipper is, it stretched a little when I put the zipper in, so I had to stretch my lining just to match it up. And again, I'm doing this with the slip stitch technique, or I like to call it sometimes the tunnel and bite, which basically means you go through the tunnel, which is the fold created by the lining, and then you take a bite of the outer fabric, and you just do this over and over again until you're to the end of your project. I would recommend that your tunnels be no more than 1/2 inch, and your goal is to have as little thread showing as possible. That's why we would definitely do this in the color of the garment, in my case, black. Here you can see that I'm prepping the midriff for its own slip stitch. I'm pushing that seam allowance from the waistline and the midriff on the outside up inside the lining, so you won't see it once I've folded the lining 1/2 inch in and I've slip stitched it down. For basically all of my sewing career, I have found it most comfortable to hand sew from the right hand side to the left hand side. I believe that's just because my left hand can hold the fabric, and then that leaves my right hand free to do the majority of the sewing work since I'm right-handed. But that's not a hard, fast rule. If you find that sewing from the left side to the right side is more comfortable for you, then that's perfectly acceptable, and do what's comfortable for you. I'm not going to sew down the midriff band entirely in one shot. What I'm going to do is pick a couple anchor points, and then that way I know certain things are lined up that need to be lined up, and I can work with the fabric that's in between those anchor points. So my first anchor point here is the side seam of the dress. I'm going to pin the side seam of the dress on both sides, and then I'll work on the fabric that's in between the zipper and the side seam. Now you're probably saying to yourself at this point in time, Megan, what does it matter? Why can't I just pin all the way around? And you know, you would be right, But the reason I teach people to pin, from certain location to certain location is the same reason I have people sew from center outward or center back outward. It's to make sure that everything within the garment lies flat and straight. And lining is a very tricky concept to master. So these are just some tips that I have that will help your lining lay really nice and flat inside your garment. And as all my video descriptions say, take what works for you and leave behind what doesn't. Now that we've flipped around to the front of the garment, I think it's starting to show how beautiful this garment's really coming together and what a big difference a lining makes in a project. So I'm pushing all of the seam allowance from the waist up into the midriff piece, making sure that every piece of fabric is following the straight of grain and will be laying nice and flat when you've got the dress on. We don't want any kind of weird pulling or bumps when we have our final project. And finally, the last area on our garment that we're going to slip stitch. Wait, I might be lying about that. I think we have to slip stitch in the cuff, but at least it's the last in the actual dress. I believe I mentioned it earlier in the video, but the reason I decided to do a slip stitch here versus just a zigzag seam finish is the gold sparkly fabric can get very itchy and irritating to the skin. So right now I'm pushing all the seam allowance that attached the sleeve to the armhole. That gets pushed underneath the lining, and I'm gonna pin all the way around the armhole. Again, making sure that my garment is nice and flat every time I pin. We don't want any puckering. You're going to complete this pinning around the entire arm's eye, and then you're gonna go back and guess what? You're gonna slip stitch it. When you're slip stitching this armhole, there's two things I want you to look out for. One is that your shoulder seams line up. So the shoulder seam of the shell of the garment should line up with the lining of the garment. And then when you're coming out of the cap of the sleeve, that's where you tend to see the most wrinkles or pulls. You want to make sure those areas are nice and flat. At this point, we've got a few simple finishing techniques and a little bit more sewing with the cuff, but we're really about 90% done with the dress. So what I'm showing you here is how I shorten a zipper. The zipper I had on hand, it just happened to be a really, really long zipper. So what I'm doing is with a hand sewing needle, I'm going to wrap my thread around the zipper teeth 6 to 8 times. So I'm going through the tape, coming up, wrapping around the teeth, going back down through the tape, and this will stop the zipper pull should it make it past the end of the zipper on the garment. It'll stop the zipper pull from swinging right off the zipper, and then you've got a broken zipper in your garment. Once you've got it properly closed, just take a pair of scissors and cut off past that closure, and now your zipper is the proper length. At the top of any kind of zipper, you're going to need a closure, and that helps keep the zipper from sliding down while you're wearing it. In this case, we're going to use a hook and eye. Now, I have a separate video that I've linked above on how to sew on a hook and eye, so I've sped this part up a little bit. But the basics are, take the hook part and you want to line the edge up right behind your zipper. You don't want to see any part of the hook poking out from behind the fabric. Take a double-threaded needle and lace in and out of the holes on the hook. You also want to lock down the actual hook part by threading over it a couple of times. That way the hook doesn't flop back and forth. When attaching your hook and eye, you want to make sure that you're not sewing through to the front part of the garment. You only want to go through the lining because we don't want to see any stitching on the outside. Once you're done with the hook on one side, move on to the eye on the other side. Just as with the hook, we're going to make sure the eye is lined up with the very edge of the fabric so we don't see any of the hook and eye once the dress is zippered closed. In the interest of saving time, I didn't film doing the hem for this dress. All I did was apply a simple rolled hem to the bottom of the dress, and if you're not sure how to complete a rolled hem, I've attached a video above. On we go to the last step of our garment, the cuff, which I decided to add. Now, you can very easily just do a rolled hem on the sleeves and leave them bell-shaped, but I decided to gather them in for a cuff at the wrist. I cut these back in the first video, and we're gonna sew the lining to the shell at a 5/8 seam allowance. Both sides of the cuff will receive a straight stitch sewn with a seam allowance of 5/8 and a stitch length of 3. And once you're done sewing, we're gonna do some understitching towards the lining of the cuff. Just like we did with the neckline of the dress, we're gonna push our seam allowance towards the lining, and we're gonna stitch it down approximately 1/8 of an inch away from the original seam. Once you're done with the stitching part, you can trim off any extra seam allowance to reduce the bulk in your cuff. As you can see here, my understitching is nice and flat, and when you flip it over to the right side of the garment, it's very straight and even. Next, fold your cuff in half to make a tube. So basically taking one side of the seam and matching it with the other side of the seam. We're gonna sew this tube closed at a 5/8 seam allowance. Don't forget to do both cuffs for both sleeves. Once you're done, I'm flipping it inside out just so I can test it on my hand and make sure that the cuff is the proper width, not too tight and not too loose. Once our cuff is assembled, I'm adding a basting stitch to the edge of the sleeve. Like usual, I split my basting stitches into chunks, so that way I'm not pulling too much with one basting stitch, so I'm doing half the sleeve in one fell swoop and half the sleeve in the other. And just in case you need your memory refreshed, a basting stitch is when we sew with the length all the way turned up. In my machine's case, it's a length of 4. There's no back stitching at the front and the end, only leaving long tails so we're able to pull one side of the thread in to gather our fabric. Let me be honest here, I think I put off doing the cuff until the very end of the dress because it is a little bit on the tricky side. We've got a heck of a lot of fabric to gather into a very small area, but when you see how cool this cuff is going to look, it's really going to be worth it. I picked one end of my gathering stitches and I tied a knot, and then I took the other end and I'm essentially pulling in the sleeve as much as I can. I'm going to pull it in and then measure it with my cuff to determine exactly how much gathering I need. Anytime you're doing gathering in a garment, you want to be nice and gentle with your pulls. If you pull too hard, you'll break your thread and then you have to start over again. Once you're ready, take the cuff and slide it onto your arm with the lining side facing away from you. You're going to slip it onto the sleeve, pulling the end of the sleeve through and matching the end of the sleeve with the fabric side of the cuff, or basically the shell of the cuff. I'm making sure to line up the seam of the cuff with the seam of the sleeve. And again, this can be a little bit tricky because you're working in a very small area. Once I've got those two seams lined up and pinned together, I'm going to work my way around that entire hole, making sure the gathers are evenly distributed. They say sewing is an art more than a science, and it couldn't be more true in the case of gathering. Gathering takes a little bit of finesse, so if it takes you a few times to get the hang of really putting your gathers in the right place, don't beat yourself up. It took me a long time to get really good at it too, and I still feel like I could improve. One thing I would definitely change about this step when I did it on the other sleeve is I made sure the pins were facing the other way. How I'm pinning it right now, the sharp end of the pin is facing me, and it ended up being a little prickly when I went to sew it on the machine, so make sure your pins are facing away from you, not towards you. With the gathers evenly distributed and pinned in place, I went over to the sewing machine and I attached the cuff at 1/2 inch. I usually sew inside the circle, if you can kind of see what I mean when I'm sewing small areas. That way I can control where the gathers are versus sewing from the outside of the circle. This is one of those spots that I want to remind you again to take your time. There's no prize for first place, so you're better off taking your time and doing it right than having to do it over again. Now that the shell fabric of the cuff is attached, the last step of this entire project is to hand stitch in the lining. I flipped the sleeve inside out, and I took that seam that we just created by sewing the shell fabric to the sleeve and I pushed it up inside the cuff. And then I folded the edge of the lining of the cuff underneath by about 1/2 inch, whatever it takes to make sure that your lining is laying nice and flat. We're gonna bring back that handy dandy slip stitch one more time. Well, 2 more times because there's 2 cuffs, but one more time for our final step on our garment. I'm slip stitching all the way around that gathered piece that I just sewed to create a beautiful finished off couture look at the end of our sleeve. And here's a final look at our gathered sleeve cuff. And here's our final product. If you made it through all 3 videos and completed this dress, I'd love for you to send me a picture at meghangracediy@gmail.com so I can offer you congratulations. I love having sleeves on an evening gown. Too often us girls are cold when we go out, and I want to be warm this winter. So I hope you enjoyed this project. I'm so proud of you if you made it all the way to the end. If you'd like to be notified when I post new videos and new projects, please feel free to hit the subscribe and the notify button. And if you'd like more information, please feel free to follow me on Facebook, Pinterest, and Instagram. And as always, happy sewing!